everybody, and welcome to Fraudible, the official podcast of the International Society of Economic and Criminology. And Fraudible is the podcast that brings together academics and practitioners to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're going to be discussing fraud and terrorism financing, and I'm delighted to be joined by academic Professor Ryder and practitioner Jess, Cath. So hi guys, thank you so much for joining me today. Super glad to have you here. Nick, would you mind just giving a brief overview about yourself and your work?
Yeah, again, thank you for having me back. Hopefully the last time wasn't too bad for you. So I'm a professor in financial crime from Cardiff University and specialise in pretty much all things financial crime, and was lucky enough to be the special advisor for Home Affairs Select Committee's fraud investigation in 23 to 24.
Thank you very much, Jess.
Lovely to be here. I'm Jess, and I'm the financial crime partner at Thistle Initiatives. I'm glad to say that this is not actually our office, because it would be very empty if it was. But this is our background here. So I head up their financial crime department, and we do three main things. So I do a lot of auditing, assurance and testing work on all parts of the financial crime framework. I also do a lot of fixing, so remediating, fixing, advising on how to fix things. And I also put people in as well. So put people and teams in to help solve problems.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Nick, you've been doing a lot of writing recently on the terrorism aspect of things. Any key insights, any spoilers we can...
Oh, if that isn't a loaded question. Yeah. So we started looking at the link between fraud and terrorism about 6 years ago, and presented a really early summary of the paper at the Wales Fraud Forum in Cardiff. And then since then, it snowballed into a bigger project, and the paper was published last August, 2024. And what the research has illustrated, and terrorism financing of all financial crime research is the lesser published. It's the lesser sort of written about by academic scholars, and it's lesser talked about, I think, and for obvious reasons. But what we were able to identify is that terrorists have a black book or a dossier. So if you look at the links in between fraud and terrorism, by looking at decided cases from the US, EU, UK, Australasia, Asia Pacific Rim, we were able to identify common frauds used by terrorist groups from ISIS, Al Qaeda, and so on. And it sort of indicates that the paper sort of concluded there were some deficiencies within the counter-fraud strategy as it was in May 2023. Obviously, a new one now is promised by Christmas of this year, and the UK's terrorism strategies. So that's the premise to where we sort of concluded, is that this is one of the most frequently used methods to fund acts of terrorism globally.
Jess, you've been in the consulting space for years now. Is there anything specific to your work that you've seen around the terrorism side of things that stands out?
I think terrorist financing is a really interesting topic because it's often sidelined. Even though it's not sidelined, the regulatory framework is very clear. Everyone must build counter-terrorist financing frameworks. But the same with proliferation financing as well. It's the kind of ugly duckling that firms really don't want to deal with, because a lot of firms that we deal with that are in payments or retail banking or lending, they will think that they are just not exposed to terrorist financing. So, for example, if you take a UK-based retail payments product, they will think, no, we only deal with UK-based customers. It's not going to be an issue that we see very often. So let's not think about it. Let's think about some other fraud typologies or some of the traditional money laundering, bribery and corruption typologies. And often it's completely sidelined. But it's very difficult to actually track, particularly the kind of lone wolf attacks and how those are taking place and how to really spot those effectively in frameworks. So it's very complicated, and it's one that's sidelined because of its complexity as well.
But because it's so complex, surely that should trigger organisations to think that it's all the more important, because you can't sort of go for the quick, easy wins all the time, can you?
But flipping on its head a little bit, it's not necessarily one that they think they're going to be fined for or come up against very often. So every business is required to put fraud frameworks in place because they lose money when they are impacted by fraud. Particularly with the mandatory reimbursement requirements, you have to reimburse your customers. So there's a financial incentive to get your fraud controls in place. Traditional money laundering frameworks, they're very clear. They've been in place for a long time. Everyone knows that if you money launder, you may get a very big fine. They are then focusing on it. Now, of course, the regulations are called money laundering and terrorist financing, so it's very, very clear that you need to build these frameworks, but it's often something that is just not seen as important as the money laundering side, and something that they can kind of get away with just building a few basic monitoring rule sets based on a few simple typologies, and that will be enough for that firm to get them over the line and to deal with their regulatory requirements.
Do you find then, Nick, in terms of the work that you've done from a political perspective, that this is something that is on their radar, not so much on their radar, should be?
I think you can tell by the smile that I think that there is an issue. I think there are some deficiencies within. So after we'd released this paper and gave evidence in the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, I think it was January of last year. I wouldn't want to do that again. That was quite nerve-wracking. The difficulty is that if you look at the history of domestic terrorism, the IRA plus other groups have been funded by fraud for decades. This goes back 40, 50, 60 years. That's been acknowledged in select committee inquiries. It's been acknowledged by government reports. It's been acknowledged that even the fraud review said 2006, we acknowledge that some acts of terrorism are committed by fraud. So despite promises by the government to successive governments, Conservative, Labour, coalition, Conservative and Labour. So despite sort of promises in various review documents to acknowledge this threat and to close the loopholes, nothing's happened. So the May 23 strategy, for example, mentions terrorism on 4 occasions. And it doesn't give any sort of policy guidelines or strategies as to how to rectify or to tackle that particular problem. Now, luckily, acts of terrorism in the UK are very, very, very rare. And, credit has to go to law enforcement, the intelligence services, in terms of the amazing work that they do. But if you dig into the inquiries into, for example, the 7/7 attack, if you dig into the Ariana Grande concert bombing, if you dig into the London Bridge attack in June of that 2017, you will find that fraud is a key facilitator for those acts of terrorism. So, and I think, as Cath pointed out, it is virtually impossible. I've not found any examples of where a SAR has actually prevented an act of terrorism. They're always going to be retrospective. But I think here's the intriguing point, is that if you look at the 9/11 financing, you've got multiple wire transfers from United Arab Emirates into, all documented in the 9/11 Commission, all into banks in the eastern seaboard of America. Now, the Bank Secrecy Act is not built to tackle terrorism financing. It was there to tackle tax evasion and money laundering and to prevent illicit money entering the US system. But the Americans adopted the money laundering model to tackle terrorism financing. So you are looking through the wrong lens. Terrorism financing would not necessarily be the same typologies used for money laundering, for example, and by fraud. If you've got low-cost fraud, where terrorists are able to purchase low-capability weapons, such as a knife or whatever it might be, given that fraud is a very low priority for multiple police forces across the UK because of long issues regarding resources, train officers to do that. So if you look at the response to the mutual evaluation report by the government, as it was then, we do everything to disrupt acts of terrorism. So if that's the case, then why isn't arresting terrorists for fraud used to disrupt acts of terrorism. So CPS website, for example, 2016 to 2021 as part of the paper, there were 3 cases of terrorism, financing and fraud convictions, 3. It's like less than 3%. You look at sort of comparisons to America, where most prosecutions and convictions are for terrorism financing are for fraud, between 17 to 20%. So, yeah, Cath made a very valid point. It is impossible to maybe look at money through the normal sort of reported entities, your banks, your lawyers, for example. But 9/11 serves as that catalyst. All transactions were subjected to a currency transaction report by the banks. Not one was deemed to be suspicious. Not one red flag was raised. And those reports went to FinCEN in September 2000. So they were one of 1.3 million reports filed to FinCEN in 2000, 2001. So to use the proverbial phrase, needle in a haystack, that's the problem. So it's as if we've adopted the money laundering global model. Oh, that can be used to tackle terrorism financing, when really they are significantly different. So if you look at sort of emerging typologies like fraud, for example, or crypto, social media, the rebirth of state-sponsored terrorism again, or where you've now actually got terrorists cooperating, coordinating together. For example, you've got the Taliban and Al-Qaeda looking to abuse natural resources now in Afghanistan since the fall several years ago. You've got sort of, Hamas working with other terrorist groups. The sophistication is there. They haven't gone away anywhere.
No.
But it's a question of, the national risk assessment now should be at some point this year. So it'll be intriguing to see what difference the current threats perceived by the current government for that.
And then I guess then looking at it from your perspective then, Jess, if you see clients of yours trying to use certain strategies, certain tools across all the different typologies, whether it's for cost benefit or for operational savings, surely that must cause you a lot of issues in that you need to sort of go back to basics and educate people and say, well, actually, you can't use this one framework across AML, fraud and everything else. How does that work?
It's really complicated and really hard. So we have some clients that create a combined financial crime team that are dealing with lots of different typologies. So you might have fraud experts within that team, you might have AML experts, but they're very much working together. But that's not the norm. Usually firms will separate out different teams and separate out your AML function from your fraud function, your customer onboarding and ongoing monitoring from your transaction monitoring functions, which means that each function is looking at very different risk areas, looking at different parts of the customer journey, looking at different parts of the transaction journey. And it's about bringing all of those parts together and identifying areas of higher risk in those different parts, and trying to bring those together in a really strong risk assessment in order to pick out where your risks might be. And that's very, very, very hard. We are seeing some really, really good work with dynamic customer risk assessments that are picking out, flags across transaction monitoring with and other red flags in the customer profile with adverse media screening, etc. Pulling all of those data points together into a really interesting, strong customer risk assessment methodology where flags actually do appear. But that in reality is very difficult to put together. So if we strip it back and think, well, what does that actually mean in practice? So to Nick's point on the academic side, you've identified so many different typologies or threats or new actors. When you're then on the ground in practice, that means that a firm has to pull together 150, 200 live data points across multiple systems, across multiple teams, from lots of different data sets on a relatively live basis in order to pick out where the threats might be. And that's really hard.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's all fine for me to sit in the ivory tower looking down and but it is trying to sort of identify problems and loopholes and trying to engage. And, and in fairness to the sort of government officials I worked with, they've been very open, very receptive to ideas. Obviously, some things they agree with, other things they don't agree with. And, I haven't got access to SARS. That would be lovely. I haven't got access to, official reports by government departments that are off the books, and that is sort of classified, for example. But, I think what it does demonstrate is that the use of, for example, SARS in relation to terrorism financing, it's very, very, very rare that is ever going to preempt an act of terrorism. I mean, you'd have to sort of, as you said, I think, Cath, data sets and staff involved in. I mean, and unluckily, acts of terrorism in the UK are very, very, very rare. But I think what the report did suggest is that there are still deficiencies within what the government has done, and they've recognised the threat. I think in the response to the Home Affairs Select Committee, the current government did acknowledge there was a threat, but it's a very, very minor threat. But it just seems interesting that fraud always crept up as a common type of low capability crime that terrorists did commit. And then if you add that into new forms of technology, I say new forms of technology in terms of cryptocurrencies and sort of social media outlets, that becomes even more then difficult to detect. I mean, there was a FATF meeting 18 months ago where figures were paraded around that there'd been I think 1/5 of all terrorist cases were now linked into crypto, and that there'd been so many percentage increase of attacks financed by crypto. Thinking, well, there is no methodology in that report. There is no report. So I think with a lot of the terrorism cases, it's the retrospective investigation which then identifies where the money has come from and where the sources come from. And as we've seen, for example, with the 7/7 attack, the official inquiry mentioned the terrorists were petty fraudsters. Well, that to me is a red flag. And hindsight's a wonderful thing, but there are certain types of financial activity that, that you look at the sort of the paper. I mean, we've sort of looked at, for example, passport fraud. Then you look into immigration fraud, and then so once you've got that identity falsified and set up, that opens up to you, for example, to financial fraud, debit card and credit card, which it opens up further avenues. And Karim Butt, for example, one of the terrorists in June 2017, he defrauded Santander, his own bank, for sort of going into the ATM, withdrawing cash and claiming it wasn't him. He also successfully applied for a payday loan worth up to £10,000 that was discovered after the attack. So you can see that the evidence is there. And, even Salman Abedi for the Manchester bombing had attended university. He didn't attend any classes. He was a student loan fraud. So, but luckily they're very, very, very rare.
That's a really interesting point, just very quickly, because when I often work with credit lenders, they seem to think that they are very low risk for lots of typologies. And in many ways, that product set is, because they're applying for a loan. The actual transaction flows are very, very simple vanilla flows. It's going out to one person that's approved at the start of the loan. If there's any third party involved, that's very carefully controlled. But there are so many ways that you can use different lending products to very easily hide illicit sources or purposes. And it's really about understanding who is the customer and what is the purpose of their doing business. And I think if we strip a lot of this back, we have kind of lost some of those basic questions when it comes to trying to fight fraud, trying to fight different types of financial crime. We are trying to do it with lots of controls, lots of pieces of regulation, but ultimately we just need to strip it back and actually understand who the customer is and what they are trying to do with their money. That's the simple question that often gets lost when we're having these conversations, is who are they? What are they trying to do with it?
And I think that's a very valid point. I think even if you go back to the San Bernardino attack in California, the terrorists had paid the loans worth $26,000 to buy the armaments they used. So the unregulated credit sector. So what we have in the UK, obviously, is access to convenient credit. The UK economy thrives on convenient credit, where, lenders are quite happy to, my credit card's been increased. I didn't ask for it to be authorised. They said, yes, Nick, we'll happily extend yours. We'll double it to X thousand. It's like, oh, thank you very much. But so if you have that access to convenient credit, it does make it potentially a loophole that the wrong individuals are possible can exploit. And I think it's interesting that if you look at the organised crime strategy and fraud, that mentions fraud on 80 plus occasions. But the fraud strategy doesn't really discuss terrorism. It's just sort of given it a bit of a fleeting glance. And, maybe the new strategy might alter things, but yeah, it's an intriguing area.
So what is it going to take then for I'm going to ask you, Nick, because of that laugh. What's it going to take for government, for organisations, for everyone essentially to start considering and terrorism financing on the same level of urgency that we're currently seeing in the fraud space?
If I could answer that question in 34 minutes, I'd be a very rich man. I think back what I wrote in the paper now. I think that the fraud strategy needs to be revised. I wrote in the paper that there needs to be practical advice and guidance acknowledging this particular threat as opposed to a mere glance or a sort of a fleeting brief paragraph to it. And I think that it's the broken promises the last 10, 15 years of, yes, we will look at the loopholes, for example, in reporting fraud. I think we've discussed that, Claire, before, in terms of the current mess that we have about reporting fraud. And, despite the best action of staffing action fraud and the police, lack of funding is a massive issue. The sheer volume of fraud that we have on a regular basis, and fraud, for example, from social media platforms, Instagram, and all of that sort of data. So I think that for me, the fraud strategy needs to be carefully reevaluated, and to acknowledge the link between the domestic groups and international groups will finance attacks by fraud. So I think that's one thing. I think that needs to be acknowledged in the national risk assessment. Maybe that will have got no sort of incident information in relation to what that will provide. So I think there also needs to be a terrorism financing strategy. We've got contests, but there needs to be an acknowledgement that, terrorists can acquire funding through multiple avenues, whether it's their own wages or, as Cath mentioned, the lone wolf type of terrorist that sort of uses a credit card or a misuse of a loan, for example. I could go and bore you with data sharing. I think that's another issue, I think, in itself. What we found in another study is that 3 acts of terrorism, and if anybody listening wants a copy, it's all available online, so it's not sort of behind a paywall. We found 3 acts of terrorism where data wasn't shared in relation to terrorism financing and fraud. So Salman of AD, the Ariana Grande concerts, the London Bridge attack, 2005, and also carrying butts. So there are instances where things could have been done better, but no scheme is perfect. You're always going to have that missed opportunity. Gimlet is seen to be a model of moving forward, and that was praised by FATF, especially after the London Bridge attack, where within 12 hours they could identify the card use. So that is a great example of law enforcement working with the private sector to really efforts to tackle financial crimes. So that probably would be, whether we go to the route of automatic information exchange, like you have with tax fraud, but that's blue sky thinking from my point of view, I think.
And I think also, Jess, and just thinking back to sort of how long we've both been in the practitioner side of things, like I've never seen any team or any job adverts listed that are targeted solely at the terrorism financing side of things. I've never seen like a job advert for a terrorism financing analyst, say. It's always for AML, it's always for fraud. You get the odd one for bribery and corruption, but nothing on the terrorism financing side. Is that something that you think should change, that should come into force, or do you think that that's still not necessarily going to get the traction that it deserves?
So yes, you're absolutely right. You don't often see these roles. It would be such an interesting role if you did see more of these. But no, you don't often see this. And it comes back to the point I made at the start, that it's not in the firm's interest to spend too much money on the controls here. I mean, I always approach any of my projects with a commercial head-on. You know, I'm dealing with clients who've got fixed budgets and they have to do what they can do within their commercial budget. You know, I've got clients that have got 50% of their whole business that's in compliance. That's not actually an effective business. So I think just by adding in extra roles or extra people to try and deal with terrorist financing as a separate typology might not be appropriate, particularly for some of those smaller firms. Obviously, your HSBCs, your tier one banks, they've got the grand luxury of having teams focused on certain typologies that they're seeing across the globe, and they've got big sort of FIU intelligence units that are looking at specific problems and challenges. But for people in payments or other firms in crypto, you will very rarely see that, and I don't think they've got the space to go and hire someone purely focused on that area. And I also don't think it would be appropriate. But what I do think firms should do is to step back and really look at what are the risks that they see on the platform. It's going back to the old simple risk assessment. You know, what is your product? Who are your customers? Where are you doing business? And what are you most exposed to? And then looking at putting your resources in the right place.
So it's about building frameworks that align to the product set, the customer base, and putting the right money where they need to. The other thing I wanted to pick up on, though, Nick, you raised an interesting point about data sharing. And nobody likes talking about data sharing anymore because we've been talking about it for... every single conference you go to in fraud or financial crime, everyone's still talking about the need for data sharing. I think this point is fundamentally why the financial crime framework does not work. And each different firm is putting in a small bit of controls in order to spot suspicion in their silo and then report something to the National Crime Agency in the UK. And they may or may not get feedback on it. And they continue doing this every single day. And a lot of firms are defensive filing what they think is suspicious. And that's basically what they're doing on the ground. And that's all they need to do. Now, we really do need to be sharing information between firms. We also need to be sharing information with social media platforms, telecommunications. We are nowhere near that yet, and there are some real complexities about how to share this. To give one real-world example, when I was working with a number of firms to try and create a bit of a data sharing initiative, what is a confirmed instance of suspicion at one firm actually looks very different to what might look suspicious at another firm. So how do you start sharing what you believe to be suspicious, which might not be so suspicious for somebody else? And if you share that wrong, you might actually prevent real customers from accessing financial services. Because what you deem to be wrong might not be wrong, and you might end up with bias or vulnerable customer issues where the whole thing around financial crime prevention is then completely destroying what financial services should be doing, which is providing access to finance.
Yeah, and I think that with the whole data sharing, I mean, you know, we've had multiple amendments. I mean, I'll go back to the 7/7 attack where the legal framework allowed certain bodies to share data, but they didn't. And I mean, you know, maybe there's legitimate reasons as to why that wasn't the case. And there is a, you know, again, from an academic perspective, there appears to be a reluctance looking through the window that, you know, the private sector is reluctant to share data with the public sector and vice versa, and also the public sector to the public sector. So if anything, it does show that there are some deficiencies within, and I'm being particularly polite there, deficiencies within the current policy strategy towards data sharing. Because ultimately, if you're bringing multiple reporting agencies into one, you know, I think the phrase a lot of people use is a superstar. You've got access to, or yeah, you know, Nick's deposited cash in a bank in Cardiff. Another bank can go, yeah, well, why does he own 4 companies in Glasgow? Why has he got shares in company X? And so you build up a more holistic understanding of a suspected money launderer, fraudster. So I think it's intriguing that, you know, EC that does try to broaden the data sharing provisions, but I think there is reluctance from the sector because well, if we share data, we might be subjected to an investigation or might be subjected to a fine in terms of breaching GDPR. And as you correctly pointed, of course, this then goes against the grain, the core objective of a bank or credit card is by providing finance. It's a very fine line to draw between what is proportionate and what is disproportionate regarding sort of Human Rights Act and the European Convention of Human Rights. But I still think that there is a broader concern regarding economic crime policy by the current government and the former government. It's very much, we'll be a bit reactive. We might do this, we might do that. We still haven't got a minister, for example, for economic crime. I mean, I think every committee report I've read in the last 10 years has recommended there should be a minister exclusively with that particular mandate. So it comes down to strategy, enforcement, political will. So there's lots of issues, and the SARS regime is far from perfect. And you've got the low threshold, defensive reporting. You've got the fear factor of getting a fine by the FCA where there isn't any evidence of money laundering. And then you don't get fines where there is evidence of money laundering. I won't go back to the Abacha money laundering case in 2002, but again, you get my point with 15 banks. You've got weak levels of compliance, but we will not fine you. So it's all collectively, I think there needs to be a careful rethink of, what is our illicit finance strategy linking into bribery, corruption, fraud, money laundering. It's got to be one policy, at least sort of to drive with key objectives and KPIs, but I'd be surprised if that happens.
You mentioned earlier, Jess, about how companies need to go back to the risk assessment, go back to the very beginning, look at what their risks are and what they are exposed to. But you also said that companies often feel like they are exempt from being exposed to various risks. So how do you try and educate people in organisations that actually no one is immune from being exposed to these risks? How do you try to get across the importance of putting these controls in place for terrorism financing if people don't think that they're going to be hit by it in the first place?
Lots of firms have got very, very weak financial crime risk assessments. So when we come in and have a look at their risk assessment, either at an audit or they've brought us in because they just know that risk assessment is very, very weak. We are brought in to really take them through the journey of figuring out what their risks are. So a lot of the risk assessments that I see are very high level. They look at the first level of assessment. They don't go further down to explore individual scenarios and individual typologies and how they might actually happen on their platform. So we'll quite often say, we see this type of customer doing this type of transaction and that is it. But actually they haven't explored how they might use that in different ways or looked at how different typologies might take place on the platform. But to do that effectively, you really need to understand a lot about financial crime and a lot about the current typologies that are actually taking place. So you need to have a strong MLRO and you need to have a strong financial crime team to actually work through those scenarios to figure out what you might be exposed to. Because quite often firms are not aware of the sorts of scenarios they might be exposed to, and therefore the sorts of controls they have to build to mitigate those. So ultimately it comes down to not really understanding the different types of risks that are out there and gaming those out with the products that they have.
And I think that the other point, of course, is it comes into criminal liability. We've seen significant enforcement activity in the UK by the FCA in the past, FSA's predecessor. We've seen significant enforcement activity in the US with the Department of Justice and so on. But it's not as if you've had, I think there's only one example of Lafarge, a French company, that was charged last October with financing ISIS, for example. So what that case will lead to, I don't know, but it's very, very, very rare for a fine to be imposed. In the UK that I'm aware of, for each of the counter-terrorism financing, it's normally money laundering, weak levels of compliance, bribery, corruption. Not necessarily for terrorism financing. So either the systems are completely perfect, or are we going to see more enforcement activity? I'm not quite sure.
That's a really good point though, Nick, because still to this day, quite often when I'm looking at reports from the regulator to firms, they're still picking up on things like your contents page is not up to date in your AML policy, instead of really thinking about what is the product, have you built controls that are proportionate? And whilst we're continuously talking about the risk-based approach and building those controls that are in alignment to the risk, we are still very much seeing the regulator looking at some of those tick boxy compliance things, which actually don't prevent crime.
So do we almost need a fine to be issued in the UK because of this for companies to sit up and think, oh, hang on a second, this needs to change? Or is that really not going to have the desired impact, do you think?
There is some scepticism amongst academic commentators and the third sector regarding enforcement strategies. I think that there have been some concerns regarding the use of deferred prosecution agreements, for example. I know that there is some academic literature recently which is a little bit sceptical of extending failure to prevent fraud, because in its own risk assessment, the Home Office and the SFO said, yeah, we'll hardly ever use the case. So why implement failure to prevent fraud? And there was a big discussion regarding should be, for example, failure to prevent money laundering, which to me probably would be the obvious extension of FTP. So ECTA defines a new senior manager, for example, so it tends to replace the identification doctrine. But if we look at efforts to use senior manager previously, they've not worked out. So you look at the Banking Reform Financial Services Act 2013, that creates the offence of reckless misconduct. If a bank goes into insolvency because the conduct of a director, that person can be prosecuted. It's never been used. And it never will be used because, banks are too big to fail, too big to jail. So all the key involvement in the economy, and there's a lot of literature on that. So I think enforcement is there's been some good blogs by RUSI, Transparency International, Spotted on Corruption, have all sort of questioned the effectiveness or not. And I've no doubt that law enforcement work very, very, very hard in terms of investigating and bringing these cases. So but again, I draw back to Criminal Finances Act. It's never been used. So 8 years of the act being enforced for tax, lots of investigations going on. So I think that there is a reluctance, maybe. I don't know, maybe that's a bit unfair, but based upon what I've read, what I've written, and sort of engagement with the Law Commission of the Failure to Prevent model. Will we have a fine? I don't think we will. I think that will be very, very, very rare. Will we get fines in America? Probably not. I think we've seen President Trump backtrack on a lot of financial crime initiatives, the crypto team, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example. I think more probably will be scaled back. I think there were some reports of extending the Bank Secrecy Act to $100,000, for example, before implementing a currency transaction report. So maybe the European country, maybe the French, maybe the Germans might take this up. Other countries have been sort of paraded as good examples, Singapore, Australia. So wait to see, I think.
In terms of the failure to prevent fraud offence, this is really interesting because, yes, it's coming into force very, very soon, but we have seen hardly anyone really think about preparing for it. We've had a few firms look at preparing for it, that we're helping them to sort of build their controls out. But most firms that I'm speaking to, they're thinking, let's wait until the summer and then build our controls just before it comes into force in October. So clearly people are not taking it that seriously when it comes to building out those controls. So I don't think it's going to have this. It's the same as the failure to prevent bribery. We haven't seen enough enforcement, and firms are just not looking at this as something that's going to move the dial. It also is only targeting very large firms, which of course, fraud doesn't just happen at large firms.
I think the National Audit Office report found that only 5,200 companies would actually be bound by the new failure to prevent fraud offence. So it's a very, very insignificant percentage. I mean, in fairness to the SFO and evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee, they did say we would happily use this new offence if evidence was presented. So I don't think there is lack of desire by any law enforcement agency to use its particular powers. Obviously, that will depend on what evidence is presented. But I think the intriguing point is that why can't the FCA use a DPA? They regulate 55,000 firms and the Crime and Courts Act does not specify that the FCA can use a DPA. Now, a simple piece of second legislation could amend the Crime and Courts Act and possibly extend that beyond the normal financial penalties imposed. Maybe that's me wishful thinking in terms of talking to students on a weekly basis in terms of some of this stuff. But again, it's the little things that, yeah. But no, I think you are right. The FTP for fraud is, if it's used, great. I'll be the first one to say congratulations to the SFO for using it. But based upon the last 15 years of experience of, roughly one DPA a year.
So I do always try to end episodes on a positive note. Does anyone want to chip in with something positive before I draw this episode to a close?
Well, we've got the mutual evaluation report process started, so no doubt there'll be a plethora of laws and policy statements like the 2007 mutual evaluation report and the 2018 MER. There'll be new laws, enforcement activity. We've got a new fraud strategy coming in December. That's to be great. We've had the public awareness campaign in relation to fraud. That's to be welcomed. So I think I'd leave it at probably that, I think, for now.
Excellent stuff. Excellent. Thank you very much. Jess, any final thoughts from you?
So the landscape is very difficult and challenging, but it keeps me in a job.
Well, there we go.
There we go. It's very difficult to navigate, and there's a lot of interesting things happening. And actually, a lot of firms that I speak to they're really trying to build things that work with the budgets that they have. Nobody I speak to these days doesn't want to deal with this. It's a positive attitude. It keeps me in a job.
Amen to that.
Yeah, and there's lots of students studying this, so there's a new sort of breed of people coming through in terms of young, excited academics, lawyers, business students, accountancy students who are all finding this a really fascinating topic, and they want to sort of, do what they can to help out.
Amazing. Cool. Well, that is all we have time for on this episode, and we have been discussing fraud and terrorism financing. I'd like to thank Jess and Nick ever so much for their time, and thank you very much, both of you. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.